Thank you all for joining today. I'm very, very excited to welcome everyone to this conversation. Our office is really oriented around pursuing the aims of the Baha'i faith. And the central idea behind the Baha'i faith is the oneness of humanity. And this idea has incredibly profound implications for the way that we relate to ourselves as individuals, the way we relate to each other, the way that we structure our communities, the way that we interact with our institutions, and how all of those relationships engage each other. These protagonists that really advance society, the individual, the community, the institutions. And when you think about the principle of oneness, it really has incredible implications into the future and almost an unimaginable future of what the reality of the oneness of humanity and the way that it is an expression of justice through relationships is something that we're really interested in building towards. And you could say that another idea in the Baha'i faith is that the movement towards this vision of oneness, which is a reflection of the way that we relate to each other in society, is part of an ongoing and long-term process of maturation, process of development, a collective process that is reflected in the whole of humanity. And so when you think about this process of evolution, it gives a little bit a sense of hope and agency, that we have a direction and a purpose. And that purpose, of course, is not only the oneness of humanity, but the reality and realization of peace in society. And in the movement towards this realization, we have a lot of obstacles on our path. And that is the work of our office, I think, is one, the movement towards peace, but is also thinking deeply about how do we eliminate the obstacles on the path towards the movement towards peace. And sometimes you call these problems that we have, these obstacles, wicked problems. These are problems that resist solution. And as when you try to solve them, they're like a rubber band, we kind of bounce back. And so violence of all of its many subtle and overt forms is maybe a wicked problem. Economic inequality is a wicked problem. And of course, racism, which is the theme that we're here to explore today, is another wicked problem. And one analogy that a coworker of mine recently shared was related to the idea in working through these problems of imagining the unimaginable. So not only, I think we're at a place in our development as a society where it's hard to imagine a peaceful world, a collective humanity that is expressing the maturity of oneness. That's sort of this fruit of a mature human civilization. That seems unimaginable. But what is even scarier at this moment is that we can't even imagine a world where violence, inequality, and racism, these wicked problems, don't exist. And so then the question is, well, how do we find hope in that? And so this is where the analogy that my coworker, who's checking people in, Selvi, shared this. Just yesterday we were having a reflection, and she said, think about several hundred years ago. The idea of literacy, universal literacy, was unimaginable. But humanity, over time, developed systems and structures to ensure processes of education and training such that that unimaginable reality is now unimaginable to us. We can't think of a world where literacy is not a reality for most human beings. And we have a system that has been developed to ensure that people are educated and trained to be literate. And now the other part of that analogy is it's not only that that we were able to create structures, but they have to be maintained. We have to learn our way into developing them and then maintain and strengthen them. And so I think that's really what I'm excited about with this conversation today, that we have with Dr. Christopher and Dr. Mason, who both bring a sense of possibility, of new language, new ideas, new concepts that will help us begin to imagine a world not only where racism is overcome, and the title for today's talk was very intentional. We start with overcoming racism. That's part number one. But then where do we go from there? What is it replaced with? How do we supplant it with something better? And that's where this idea of togetherness and dignity start to emerge. And of course, I think we all come at this, our office, thinking about oneness, and then Dr. Mason speaks of togetherness, and Dr. Christopher speaks of interconnectedness. These are all aspects of a different way that humanity can be reimagined. But then the question is, not only do we need the concepts, ideas, and principles to be articulated to help our understanding evolve, but then we also need a system, a structure by which we can educate and train ourselves to be able to actually build the type of world, the type of relationships, the type of people who are committed to the true and inherent dignity of what it means to be part of the human race. And that's the other beautiful thing that Dr. Mason and Dr. Christopher offer, is they both have programs, materials that bring people together to learn, train, and grow. And so that is why I'm so excited to welcome them and create this space for you all today. I have to say I've discovered Dr. Christopher on YouTube. She founded the National Day of Racial Healing at the Kellogg Foundation. And I was just exploring it and came across a talk, and I said, I have to meet her someday. And I'm so glad I was able to meet her. And we've had a few conversations, and then eventually she so graciously accepted to be part of this conversation today. And then years later, somebody suggested that we read the first book of Dr. Mason, and we loved it. And we just, on a whim, reached out to her, and that she responded with such warmth and generated a really beautiful friendship, and also a learning community. So a number of thinkers who are really thinking deeply about this idea of racelessness and how to introduce it into society more thoughtfully, because it's a sensitive issue, it's a complicated issue, but an important one. We're trying to create a conversation among a group of friends who can really work together to sort of advance this idea more thoughtfully in society. And for those who are interested, there's online, in February, a day-long symposium that was curated by Dr. Mason and the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, who happens to be here as well, which explores this theme in quite some depth. So if you want more after today, you can go view that. But without further ado, I've probably taken way too much time. But thank you all for coming. I really hope you enjoy the conversation and have a chance to engage with Dr. Christopher and Dr. Mason after the program. And with that, I will turn it over to a wonderful friend of our office and a wonderful friend of many people in this room I know, who does incredible work on this. So we're so glad that Nwandi offered to facilitate this conversation for us.
Thank you very much, PJ. And thank all of you for being here. You know, you have an intimate seat to talk with some of the great thinkers here of our time. And I want to encourage you that while on the one hand, obviously we all know about our use of devices and the fact that we turn our ringers off and all that good stuff. But I also want to encourage that you let this conversation flow out into the world, and that many of you will do that through social media and also just the messages that you'll be sending to your friends and family who weren't able to be here. And I think that has a lot to do with how far this conversation gets. Of course, we're really blessed that the U.S. Baha'i OPA office was able to bring us together for this. And so naturally, if you want to tag or in some other way hashtag that they were the ones that brought you here, I'm sure that would also be appreciated as well. I want us to have plenty of time, though, to hear from our two speakers today. And I know many of you are familiar with their work to a certain extent, but I'll just give a brief introduction before asking them to provide a lot more insight into what it is that they have been doing, both from a research lens, but also through a very practical lens. How do we move forward? And so you had a chance to hear PJ speak a little bit about both of them. But Dr. Gail C. Christopher is, of course, an award-winning social change agent. She's an author of more than 14 books, hundreds of articles. She's contributed to countless publications and has been really deeply immersed in this work for a great many years. She retired from her role as the senior advisor and vice president of the Kellogg Foundation, where she was, of course, the driving force behind the America Healing Initiative and the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation effort. So again, these opportunities to really bring practicality and a sense of experimentation to the ideas that she has been working on for so many years. She was also elected as a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, and she has chaired the board of the Trust for America's Health for 10 years. She became a senior scholar with George Mason University's Center for the Advancement of Well-Being and also the executive director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity. In 2021, she was elected to the American Public Health Association Governing Council to serve as the honorary vice president for the United States. And in 2023, the American Journal of Health Promotion honored Dr. Christopher as one of the 10 most influential women scholars in health promotion. So you can go ahead and welcome her. We're going to hear from her a little bit. Extraordinarily accomplished and wonderful to see you this morning. We were also joined by Dr. Sheena Michele Mason, and she is currently a professor of English at the State University of New York. SUNY Oneonta, am I pronouncing that correctly? Thank you. She holds a PhD in English from Howard University right here in Washington, D.C., and she specializes in Africana and American literary studies, as well as the philosophy of race. To date, she has published 2 books and several chapters in other books, as well as many, many articles. And in May of 2021, she founded the Togetherness Wayfinder. We'll talk a little bit more about this framework of rules, tools, and linguistic and informational concepts and philosophy that allow people to look for a pathway to their oneness, to their togetherness, without emphasis on racism, which is so much of how we tend to interact here in the United States. You all know, of course, that she most recently authored The Raceless Anti-Racist, Why Ending Race is the Future of Anti-Racism, and we'll be hearing more about these tools and other things that she's been able to research over the years as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mason. So for both of you, I thought it might be helpful I know that everyone in the audience has a different level of familiarity with the work that you have done, and I thought it might be helpful just for each of you to explain a little bit about the tools and the philosophy that you have been developing and how that's been flowing out into the community in the years that you've been doing this work. So maybe Dr. Christopher, could we start with you?
Thank you, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for the wonderful introductions, and I'm honored to share the stage with you. I would say that my on-ramp for this imperative was really in clinical practice. And when you work with enough human beings, and you touch enough human bodies, you realize our sameness, you know? You realize our basic interconnectedness and our basic human nature. And so that was sort of the embedded work within my own consciousness. I grew up, you know, during the civil rights era, and so, you know, I kind of had that imperative imprinted in my consciousness that our rights as African Americans in this society, you know, should be full and complete, and our humanity should not be denied. And that led me to understanding how the humanity of indigenous people was being denied, how our immigration policies were rooted in racism, and just how absurd it is that we have this false hierarchy of human value. And I began to research the history of that false taxonomy. And, you know, it is antiquated. It belongs back in the 17th and 16th century. And yet it still lives today in our systems of governance. And so the work that I've been privileged to almost be a midwife of, you know, it's about overcoming that. It's about replacing that false understanding with an ability to see ourselves in one another and to value one another as equal human beings. and all the isms that separate us, whether it's sexism, ableism, xenophobia, all these things that they become like shades, and they block our capacity to literally see ourselves in one another. So that's my initial answer. I hope that works.
Of course it does. Thank you. We'll dig in deeper as we continue. But maybe Dr. Mason, yeah, you could talk a little bit about the genesis of the work that you've been doing.
When I was an undergraduate, a short 20 years ago, I did an advanced honors thesis on Percival Everett's novel Erasure. If you are unfamiliar, go get it as soon as you leave here. American fiction, a film adaptation of that novel that came out in 2023, also highly recommend. That novel sent me down the path of researching everything race and racism and authenticity and representation as they often get imposed onto African Americans. And I was inspired to do that kind of research and thinking because I saw myself as participating in the bold, audacious, completely practical project of ending racism. I wanted to contribute to that as the thinkers that I was most inspired by were also participating in that human rights endeavor. And over the 20 years, I haven't been able to let it go. I keep researching racism and across time, across place, and ultimately that led me to conclude truly a short few years ago when I was a PhD student at Howard University that, the thing that I was picking up on 20 years ago, I finally have the language to speak about it. And namely, that first utterance was to end racism, we have to end race. And then that sent me down the path of madness. As you might be able to imagine, I felt like I was Smeagol in Lord of the Rings, for those familiar, arguing with myself in the mirror, because my mind understood because of the vastness of my study, but my heart wasn't necessarily there. My spirit weren't necessarily understanding what my mind was showing me. So then I went through the difficult process of unpacking all of that and recognizing that part of what made me want to hold on to what we call race is that all of the things that I love about Sheena Mason, my beauty, my intelligence, my tenacity, all of the things, right? My shoes. That all of those things were not and are not and will never be race. And once I was able to make that distinction, I have not looked back. And it has made me think even more critically and more deeply about, okay, having gone through the process quite literally myself, how can I help other people endure a similar process? And that's how the Togetherness Wayfinder became born.
I love this story of the birth of these processes. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about what they are, the tools that you all have been discovering along the way. And Dr. Christopher, you began to introduce the RX Racial Healing Circle. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you were able to learn through that experience?
I can, and one of my colleagues who is a Native Alaskan, she reminds us that the shortest distance between two human beings is a story. And the RX Racial Healing methodology is a curated and facilitated experience of bringing diverse people together within circles, or a circle, maybe 24, 26 people, so that they have this opportunity to share their stories with one another. And we all have so many stories, right? But in this methodology, there are two co-facilitators for each circle, and everyone has an opportunity to respond to very specific prompts. The prompts are designed to address basic human motivational needs, our needs for a sense of security, our imperative to express, and of course our fundamental need for a sense of agency. And so these prompts are particularly designed for us to invite stories, and we break into pairs or dyads, so we have an intimate opportunity to share the stories, and then we come back into the full circle. But all of the stories and the prompts, they amplify our human agency. Now the human interconnection is revealed because we're all responding to the same prompt. But the agency is built into the prompt, because what we don't want is this sense of victimization and articulation of that which triggers our stress response. And so these are not stories about racism in terms of the explicit invitation, although if you're a person of color in the United States and you share stories about your basic human needs, the issue of racism is going to surface because it's endemic. It's there in our society. But that's the process. The circles usually last 2.5 to 3 hours. And I guarantee if you give the gift of that much time in the presence of other human beings and hearing these stories, you are transformed. There is a heart resonance that is physical, it's grounded in physics, and it is a representation of the opportunity of being part of a interconnected human family.
I love that. Can you give us an example of like what a prompt might be, just so we can have that in our own minds?
I'm happy to do that. One that I love is tell a story about a time in your life when you needed to be seen or heard, and someone responded to that need. How did that affect you, and how did it show up as a result? The results of that experience show up in your life, right? And I think we all have had those moments. What distinguishes that prompt from what you might get in what is typically called an anti-racism workshop, I said someone responded to your need. And that's when it flips to a positive recollection. And it also emphasizes the agency.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're learning from the strength and not necessarily dwelling on the weakness of the situation. Makes me smile just to even hear the question. I'm wondering if we can talk as well about the togetherness wayfinder.
Rules, tools, linguistic components, philosophy, information, all of the things. When I think about a framework, a toolkit, a lens, I think about all of the components through which, when engaged, something productive and more astute analysis can happen. An example of linguistic components. So I'm quite sure we will talk about the impact of language on the kinds of stories or narratives that we tell, and how that influences how we think, how we see ourselves in relation with one another. It influences our actions or our inaction and all of the things. And so one of the central parts of the Wayfinder is using language like a person who gets racialized as, and fill in the blank, right? Not as short and sweet and quick as saying a Black person or a white person, but in making that linguistic shift, you're centering the person first, right? A person who gets racialized as, and you're showing that there's something external that's happening in relation with a person. So when we study the history of racism in any context, in talking about the impact of racism, the reality of racism through this language, we're rejecting the otherwise essentializing or naturalizing processes that we have inherited, right? In speaking about race and racism in the language of race and centering the language of race first, right, and the human second, we are inadvertently, more often than not, upholding the reality and the problems of racism. So that's one of the central components of the Wayfinder. Another component that I want to mention is the racelessness translator, or in my first book, I call it the race translator. And this is simply the analytical skills, know-how to translate race language when it appears into more appropriate form, right? It's something being communicated about culture, ethnicity, social class, economic class, or racism itself. And if we imagine we're, one of the Scooby-Doo crew, we are chasing after the villain. The villain is quite literally the literal colors, black and white, split down the middle. Race is, in fact, written on their forehead, right? We chase the villain. We've been chasing the villain now for over 400 years. We capture the villain, we demask the villain, and then that race shape-shifts into these 5 different entities. The reason why that type of translation becomes important is because, as has already been said, our ability to connect with each other, to see ourselves in each other, is hindered by the lens, the worldview, the toolkit that race/ism gives us. And what does it look like to understand more fully and more generously what one means through the language of race? And in that kind of translation too, we can empower our children, for example, to not be in the confines of race/ism in the first place, right? By giving them the tools to do this type of analysis and interpretation, understanding, and by rejecting the notion that we must forever and always perpetually teach them, pass on the hindrances, the obstacles, the barriers that racism insists that we maintain.
So both of you are describing, obviously, a new way of describing who we are, and it's so difficult because you have to do it in the environment that exists today. I like the analogy that PJ shared from Selvi about, some generations ago we couldn't imagine that we could all read, and then of course there were steps that were taken so that we could. I'm just wondering, in the current environment, and of course you have all done this for some time, so the current environment shifts a lot. But what have you found to be some of the ways to help people to overcome the idea that this is how it has always been and how it will always be? Dr. Christopher, I'll start with you.
I appreciate this conversation, and I'm so excited about your work. I want to just go back to many, many years ago, the International Year of the Disabled Person. You know how the United Nations sets up these years, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that came out of that year, which was a year that I first began to work with communities and with families, was not the International Year of the Disabled Person, but the International Year of the Person with a Disability, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. You shifted that mm-hmm. language. Mm-hmm. And it then shifted the focus, it shifted the energy. I'm focused on this human being, right, this person. I'm not focused on this one single aspect of their identity. Mm-hmm. And I think to a large measure, it was a precursor to what you're describing. I think talking about these things often is not productive. Mm. But coming together within the circles mm-hmm. or within the relationships, within the dyads, within the pairs, and then moving into these engagements that are authentic, listening. We have 2 ears, right? There's a reason for that. But being engaged in the communication, really listening to someone's story it's really an experience. And I think that's one of the best ways to move us, but we have to do it at scale. And the other element that doesn't get articulated enough, I believe, in this work, this is really about love.
Yes.
We are born of love, from love. We are love. Our bodies are created from a single cell that unites. And it doesn't add, it literally divides to become these 80 trillion cells that make up our body? Dividing, what are we dividing, right? It's the essence. It's the essence of our humanity. And that is, in my view, love.
I love it. Thank you. Dr. Mason, what has your experience been as you're trying to define a new way of describing reality?
Another central aspect of the Wayfinder is what's called philosophy of race. And part of the obstacles that we continue to face, and one of the things that I think helps more people open their minds to the possibility and indeed probability that race and therefore race/ism is not the same everywhere, it's not the same across time, across place, etc., is by exposing them or introducing them to all of the philosophies of race. So as it stands, we get socialized into only 4 of 6 philosophies of race. And 3 philosophies of race answer the question, what is race? And 3 answer the question, what should we do with it? We get taught to view race as first and foremost biological. We still teach our elementary school students that race is biological. Then, if they are fortunate perhaps enough to go on to undergraduate studies, they might take a class where now they're exposed to the idea that race is a social construction, right? Infrequently are we exposed to the idea that race is entirely imaginary. And for many people, the distinction between something being imaginary and a social construction can be challenging to get our minds around. So the best way I've come to describe it is something like, my blazer is synthetic. For all of you animal lovers, this is faux leather. My blazer is synthetic. It's human-made. It's a construction, right? Humans constructed it. I'm wearing it, it's still real. You're not imagining that I'm wearing it. I have it on, right? But in contrast to that, a unicorn is imaginary, right? I have a 5-year-old daughter, my princess. I've called her a unicorn since she was born. I have a unicorn tattoo in honor of her. She has all the unicorn merch because mom insists that she needs to love unicorns because of her nickname, right? But no amount of symbols of unicorns, toys, bedding, clothing, literal horns that she wore on her first birthday, no amount of that belief in the unicorn makes the unicorn actually real, right? It's still imaginary. And so one invitation of the Wayfinder is to consider the possibility that race is imaginary and not a construction. And you might say, well, why would that kind of distinction matter? That's just some highfalutin thing that a professor would say, right? Perhaps. But in actuality, when we open up spaces for thinking about race truly in a vastly different way than we've been taught, it does lower, if not eliminate, many of the barriers to love, to radical self-love, radical love of others in ways that working within the current matrix of race/ism prevent. And then in regards to what should we do with race, we should preserve it, we should reform it, or we should eliminate or abolish it. You guessed it, we get taught to preserve it, we get taught to reform it or reconstruct it. We almost never get taught that abolition is an option and probably desirable. Because when I spoke about madness earlier and feeling like Smeagol, was it Einstein who said that madness is the definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result? Well, for a very long time, humans have been doing the same thing, and we keep expecting a different result. And I think just looking out into the world, right, we see how ineffective doing the same thing and expecting a different result can be. So what if we do something new? What if we teach young people all of the philosophies of race, right? And especially invite engagement with the ones that are never taught.
So it's really fascinating that both of you, as you're describing, it doesn't sound like you're describing an ahistorical vision of a raceless or a racist-less society. So I am curious to find out a little bit about what you see as the role of the knowledge of history, and how do you describe it given where we are in the United States of America?
I think it's important to see this as a continuum. And yes, it is important to imagine the unimaginable, but it's also important to appreciate the unappreciated, and to recognize the journey, the amazing journey of my ancestors and my parents, and the astounding resilience that is evidenced in the fact that I'm here. You know, it wasn't until I was about 60 years old that I saw a picture of the home that my mother grew up in rural Alabama, along with 14 brothers and sisters. And, you know, it was a shack, basically. You know what I mean? I couldn't believe it, right? And this is a woman who migrated north during the Great Migration and became one of the 100 most influential black women in the United States for many years, you know, in Ebony magazine. And so as I tell that story and I affirm that reality, you know, I get goosebumps, right? Because this is from which I came, you know. So it is critically important to appreciate the usually unappreciated, you know, as part of this administration's effort to undo DEI, as they call it. You know, they did a word search, right? And so the plane that dropped the bombs over Hiroshima, I believe it was Enola Gay, right? So they had to take that out of the record because the word gay was in it, right? And they had to take away the images of the black astronauts and the black athletes, and you know what I'm saying? So let's get real, people. We really don't want to erase the lived experience. We want to learn from it. And I believe that is our challenge. But bringing people to the table so that this learning is coming from a place of value and love and appreciation, you know, that's the moment we're in. And I think we can't do it from a place of anger and fear and resentment. We really have to be in a place of understanding and oneness and compassion. I use the term, and others do, calling people in, not calling people out, you know. But history is a beautiful thing in the sense that it is how it was the on-ramp to our becoming. And so we really can't ignore or deny history, I don't believe.
So I'd be curious from your perspective, as you move toward an abolitionist stance in terms of race, where does the historical record fit into that?
I translate that into a question about colorblindness and the distinction between something like colorblindness and the wayfinder, which I want to make clear. So to my mind, right, in good faith, colorblindness is the notion that I can see you, I can translate something about you into this thing that we call race, and I can put that information in my back pocket and not enable it to let me treat you any differently, right? That's the notion behind colorblindness. And of course, we see that there are limitations to that because oftentimes, or perhaps too often, that desire to ignore race, right, by putting it in one's back pocket, actually encourages people to ignore the reality of racism. And make no mistake, right, but the entire project of the Togetherness Wayfinder is to recognize astutely the reality of racism and then do the work required to dismantle and end it. So similarly, history, right, all of it, the good, the bad, the ugly, the indifferent, all of it is a central part of the Wayfinder as a toolkit. because I don't know what. Sometimes I think about, and I get questions from my students about, wouldn't it just be easier to stay in the matrix in some ways? And I guess for some people, sure, right? But for me, on a personal level, as alienating and as lonely as it can be, as a, I guess in some ways self-proclaimed, but also other people recognize me as an outsider, right? In terms of how I think, right? I wouldn't have it any other way, because I'd rather know the truth about anything, right? The truth, the capital T, truth. So for me, the Wayfinder is a quest for truth, and we cannot get to that place or arrive to that place individually or together without a full and complete recognition and analysis and understanding of history. And the last thing I'll say, because I feel like I'm talking in circles, as I'm apt to do, which isn't a bad thing. I talk with my students about the history of our ancestors all having come from the southern part of the continent of Africa, and I talk with them about how once upon a time scientists thought that there was one migration out of Africa and then we spread all across the globe, but recently they discovered that we actually left and went back to the southern part of Africa more than once, which I think is just a fascinating thing. I talk about how all of our ancestors are shared. It's just a matter of how far back we have to go and where on your family tree our shared ancestor is, right? I talk about how if that's the reality of history, right, then why is it that we talk about the African diaspora as only people coming from the continent of Africa, let's say within the last 500 or so years, right? Aren't we all African, right? Who made the language? Who benefits from the language? Who benefits from the continued segregation and disconnectedness of all of us and our human stories? And I would argue that virtually none of us benefit from that continued disconnectedness, right?
That's very helpful. Both of you in your writing, you describe this sense of togetherness and oneness and coming to a sort of a collective identity in different ways. I'm wondering if you can both say some things about why that is essential to overcoming racism.
As I was sitting here listening and being still, I was reminded that it was a religion, or it is a religion, the Baha'i faith, that invited us to have this conversation. And I think that ultimately this work is a spiritual work. I think the oneness of which we speak is really about our spirit, if you will, our essence. Now, Einstein came to that understanding through physics. Many have come to it through physics, particularly in this 21st century. Others came through it from their cultural reality as indigenous people. But this notion of this essence of existence that is not necessarily limited to the physical is part of this journey that we are on as a human species and as a human family who all trace our roots, back to our ancestors on the continent of Africa. And then at the same time, our connection to the planet, our connection to those species that exist on the planet that enable us to exist. So I just believe this work is essential for the survival of this sort of incarnation of reality. And we have to get to that place so that we free ourselves to embrace the gift of life that we've been given. I do believe it is ultimately a spiritual work.
What about you, Dr. Mason?
I love that. One student told me that for her it was spiritual, intellectual, and emotional work. And use the word work, labor sounds arduous. It is. You're welcome. But I don't know. I, for one, have never been afraid of hard work or growing pains, if you will. And I think if we are committed to continued life on this planet, Dr. Christopher, you're absolutely right that we need to get to a place where we don't just recognize our oneness as the human species, but also our oneness with other biological beings. And Paul Gilroy talks about that in the language of planetary humanism. And to my mind, the Togetherness Wayfinder, when properly engaged, lends to this planetary humanist vision. And I do see it, therefore, as spiritual, as emotional, and as intellectual labor, but that is, again, essential and not without a cause, right? I think if we want to overcome some of the barriers to sustaining life on Earth, then we have to do this work. Because right now, isms, as Dr. Christopher said earlier, and IAs, right? Xenophobia and homophobia, all of the things, right, are obstacles to our focus on planetary issues. So I think it's critical that we start to make some progress in that way.
I guess every time we use the language of an ism or an ia, it's going to fragment us into smaller and smaller pieces. So this oneness and commonality that you all are describing, I know earlier, Dr. Christopher, you talked about scale. And I'm very curious to see what some of your thoughts and what you've actually seen, observed in the world as to what might be some mechanisms to scale. Because all over this nation, there are people who have very, very good intentions, and even they're doing hard work, but we haven't yet seen it reach the scale that maybe it would need to.
I so appreciate the question. We have this interactive map. I serve now as the executive director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity. It's an organization that I co-created some 25 years ago and came back to after I stepped down from the Kellogg Foundation. And we worked with other organizations around the country. We've produced this interactive map that identifies all the different places around the country that are doing this work, right? And it's quite impressive if you go to the nationalcollaborative.org and you see it, your eyes kind of go, whoa, all of this is happening, right? I tell young people today who are responding to this current administration, and they say, we must resist, we must resist. And my response to that is, no, you got it backwards. That's the resistance. That's the resistance to all the progress that has been made. And it's very important, I believe, to frame it that way. Because if we don't, we lose our agency, we lose our power, we lose our connection to the momentum that is there. Now, we've got to accelerate this momentum, but I mean, there's nothing like what's happening now to bring about that acceleration. I mean, people are standing up all across this country now saying, wait a minute, we don't have to hurt people. We don't have to diminish the humanity of every government worker. We don't have to destroy our NOAA, our weather system. There's something wrong with the way this is happening. It's not an extension of kindness, compassion, understanding, even democracy. And so I just want to clarify that there's so many efforts. We've described two. There's a book that was written by the person who created the concept of culture wars. He's written a new book that's called Solidarity. And one of the chapters in his book is devoted to at least 12 different efforts that are going on in this country at building connection and building bridges. And so, we have to somehow take this work, marry it to this moment of technology and social media and what they inappropriately call artificial intelligence. You know, it might be automated information, but it is not artificial intelligence. That's another conversation. But we do have to marry today's technology and use it to accelerate and expand this energy, this creative energy. And I think we will. I think we have to.
I co-sign everything that you said, Dr. Christopher. Yes. So I think that's spot on. I think about how change on a systemic level tends to happen, and I think about one model in particular which reflects a dominant model and then an emerging model, and all of the ways in between those two systems that make emerging structures very, 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 very hard, not impossible, but very hard to become the dominant. And I don't mean dominant or dominating in that kind of a way, in a pejorative way. I just mean more commonplace, right? And in order for a change to really happen, there are resources that are needed, right? Whether that's technology, whether it is money, whether it is press, like all of the things that help our current context be what it is, has to be gifted to or extended to voices like ours, ideas like ours, toolkits like ours. And that's the challenging part of this conversation when we're talking and thinking about scaling, right? Because if it were as easy as Sheena Mason, just like on my YouTube channel, I have a podcast, you know, putting out information that nobody ever sees, then it wouldn't be as arduous and the change probably would have already come. But that's just not how society works. That's not how life's, as my students would say. So we need to start a new era, a transformative era, a let's stop running in place era, a let's stop the changing same era, and that needs people. Also a resource, right? That needs all of the things. Like we need the resources in order to share the good work. And then I'll also say the institutions that need some infusion of the kinds of things that we're discussing here, right? When we're talking about K-12 education, for many of us in this room and also not in this room, this is more tenuous. This is more Smeagol-like because of the fact that we were socialized and educated in the manners in which we were. So what if I have a brilliant idea, change our education system to reflect the reality of human history, the reality of science, right? All of the things. What if we did that? Right? Because then we're not raising adults who then have to feel a bit of madness and unlearning what we've taught them to think, you know, and how we've taught them to think. So K-12 is going to be essential curriculum. And also our media institutions, religious institutions, and our government. Also, those four play the most critical role in maintaining what I call the matrix, right? And keeping us in the fishbowl. And making us think that we need water to live. But we're not fish, we don't need water to live, right? Like actually if we get out of the fishbowl, we find ourselves in outer space or something like really cool. That's the kind of benefit that can come from engaging with these toolkits. But we need people, we need voices advocating for the changes in those institutions as I've articulated. So SOS, help.
I think that's probably why we're in the room, but still, we're small in number, but I think it's mighty, and the ability to transmit these things. I'm wondering, you know, you all have stayed in this work and you've been on this path, and you know noted that it's arduous, but you've done it over time. So there must have been some examples of transformation that have kept you going. Love to hear just a few examples of how you've come to see that this work, it is effective.
I always joke when I say there are some advantages to growing older None so far that I've seen are physical, but there is this lens that you gain that enables you to capture so many examples, if you will. When we launched the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort in this country, this country, unlike more than 45 other places around the world, we have never attempted to reconcile our past as it relates to more than 2 centuries of enslavement and then the subsequent century plus of Jim Crow and denial of humanity. We just never had an effort to be honest about that and to come together in what has been recognized internationally as truth and reconciliation. So I was privileged to be at the Kellogg Foundation for a little over a decade, and we created an effort that was called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Now, we didn't say reconciliation because the connotation of reconciling is coming back together, and let's get real, we were never together in terms of the very philosophical essence of this country was the idea of a false hierarchy of human value. And so we had to transform in that sense. So when we launched that, we had over 300 organizations that were part of that. Collectively, on analysis, they reached over 200 million people. We have 75 major colleges and universities that have established Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation centers on their campus. We have over 250 public health jurisdictions that have declared the effects of racism as a public health crisis. And I could go on and on and on, and that's all within that map I was describing. So let us not delude ourselves into thinking that no progress has been made. This moment of a very narrow popular vote victory is a moment of resistance to this progress. If you don't take anything out of this meeting today from me, take heart in knowing that there is a momentum, there is a steady march. One of the reasons it's so chaotic right now in terms of trying to dismantle that is because of the scope and the scale of its effectiveness. This prior administration, every federal agency had to produce an equity plan. Now, unfortunately, they didn't talk about that enough, right? So most people, most voters didn't really get the tremendous accomplishments of the prior administration. They just worried about how much eggs cost because of the bird flu. But I'll pay $10 for an egg right now if we still had USAID, you know. I could, not everybody could, but I'm just saying what we're losing right now, you know, is far more harmful. I mean, we could actually not eat eggs. It'd be okay. You know, it wouldn't be the end of us. So there is a lot of progress that many people have been making, a tremendous philanthropic effort. And we just have to know that, like the end of Reconstruction, you know, it was the resistance to this change. And we have to examine why is it resisted, right? Part of why it's resisted is because of a zero-sum frame. And I'm gonna mention my book, my daughter's book. Some of you may, thank you. Heather McGhee, she wrote the book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And she's reached, I would say, at least 1 million people around this country in terms of her work. Or more. She'd probably be mad at me for saying that low number. But I just want us to recognize that this momentum is here, and actually it cannot be stopped.
The thing I'm going to think about most after today's conversation is the fact that Heather McGhee is your daughter. I did not know that. That is amazing. What was the prompt? I'm sorry.
the transformation you've seen in the work that keeps your momentum going.
Yes. Well, I think on a personal level, I'll keep it there. I have one former student actually sitting in the back, which he's waving. Yes, hi Shane. So he was actually one of the students in the first college courses that I taught. I taught remotely for the College of William and Mary in the fall of 2020 before I graduated from Howard with my PhD. And I was testing out in a civil rights and its literature and a Harlem Renaissance courses what I was then calling the theory of racistness. And I've seen through my courses the most significant types of transformations where students come in, like most human beings, feeling really confident and self-assured that they know exactly what the thing is, right? And then I look them in their eyes with a smile and I say, you're all incorrect. It's the privilege I have as an educator, I guess. But then I also tell them, and you're right. You're all right about something or other as it relates to this history, this conversation, and future making, and all of the things. And for many students, it's really hard to imagine the unimaginable. I ask them, close your eyes. Imagine a future, right? Whatever year it is, just imagine that a future without racism. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Right? Just imagine yourself walking in some space. Where are you? Who do you see? How are people interacting? And it's not that I am naive in thinking, oh, we dismantle or we end racism and now we live in a utopia. I'm not naive in that regard, right? I'm not romantic in that regard. I know that that's not the case, right? I just see racism as one of the primary and most dominant types of barriers that we exist within. And so on a student level, I see transformations where coming into the class, they can't even imagine, and they have trouble even thinking more deeply about the ideas because they're like, this is impossible, right? You cannot change what is so ingrained in the fabric of our society. And they go from that place to more openness and also more skepticism about like, what is race? What should we do with it, right? And they go and they go and they go and they break through the biological belief in race. It's actually amazing the percentage of students that come to see themselves as full-blown racial skeptics, meaning they no longer see race as a construction, they see racism as a construction that needs to be abolished, right? And they have the benefit of working with me over a semester-long period. But it's hopeful to me because I myself went across this journey for something like 15 years, going through all of the philosophies of race myself, being a staunch hereditary believer in race because that's what I was taught, to being a constructionist, and I was definitely a reformationist. And again, once a few things unlocked in my mind, I found myself an abolitionist and I found myself a full-blown skeptic. And I think if I could do it, I would like to say that anyone can, right? And hopefully more people will. But it doesn't have to take a decade or longer as it did for me, right? Because we do have framings, we do have toolkits, methodologies that can help people arrive in their own ways much sooner. Oh, and also the only thing constant is change too. Like,
Here we go.
Octavia Butler. I think part of the system of race/ism is to keep us believing that it's inevitable, right? That it's inescapable, that it is forever. And that kind of belief system, as you say, Dr. Christopher, it completely puts a damper on our own sense of agency and power in ways that I see as harmful. And if we look at some of the health data associated with the kinds of so-called racial inequities that we could point to, I think a lot of that is influenced or inspired by the narratives. It's inspired by the framing. It's inspired by the barriers that needn't be. So to my mind, change is inevitable. And I do think even if we don't embrace it, that fact of life, right, that our way ways of thinking is inevitable. It's just a matter of time, and it's just a matter of when.
All right. I love it. Well, I'm going to offer to all of you an opportunity also to have some dialogue. I can go out and, oh, you want to take one? Okay. So we're going to take some questions, and then we'll conclude, of course, with giving our guests an opportunity to give us a little bit of a vision for what our next steps forward might be collectively as we leave the place. But I think I saw a hand over here. Yeah, that's the two people over here. Yes, please.
My name is Fariba Parsa. Thank you so much for organizing this amazing event. I have two questions. The first question is, I am originally from Iran, and we experience racism. It's not the color of skin. It's a racism the other way. It's a religious racism, cultural racism, gender. As a woman, so we also experience racism. So it's not a color, but there are many different kinds of racism that I would like to comment. My second question is, I love the unity you talk about humanity and compassion. I'm wondering when this division started. Is it the division and then that ununity that exists among humans? Has been from the creation of humanity, or is it something developed? If it is, because I'm thinking, if you look at the human history, if you get thinking about 100,000 years ago, has been still exists this kind of racism, just different tribe, and if it was, why? And what is the cause? Is it because reality is unity, and ununity is not reality, it's imagination, it's construction?
First of all, thank you for the question. And I read this year, I had the privilege of reading a book called The Lion Women of Tehran. And it just pulled me into a deeper understanding and resonance with the experience of women in Iran and the history a little bit more. And this ability to denigrate and to devalue human beings within whatever structure we create, whether it's religious or gender or all these others, So has that been the case throughout all of history? There are scholars that have looked at that. The notion of tribalism, some people suggest that it is endemic, that it is a natural state, that it's always been there in one form or another. I can only speak from the 20th century and the 21st century in terms of my own lived experience, but I will say that I believe it is about the evolution of our individual and collective consciousness and collective experience. So I think it is about growing and developing, and whether it was always the case to be tribal, to be divided or not, I don't know that any of us have the definitive answer to that, but I do believe that as we evolve as species, it is possible to overcome that. So that would be my rather simplistic response to the question.
I second what Dr. Christopher said. I don't have anything else to really add except for an invitation to think about race not as having to do with skin color, even in a place like the United States, which can be very hard to address or to acknowledge. But when I think about the history of what we consider to be modern race, and therefore modern race/ism, I think about how you had the likes of Thomas Jefferson doing calculations to determine at what point does a family tree become white and stop being black. Because back during the period of slavery, you had the one-drop rule. And most Americans believe fiercely in the one-drop rule even today. So you have the likes of Jean Toomer or Walter Francis White or Charles Chestnut, who, if you're unfamiliar, just do a Google of any of these folks, and you look at them, and today, most people would look at them as white men, right? And yet, they are forever classified as Negro on any Wikipedia or biographical page that you could find of them. They are canonized in African American literature and African American literary studies. And it's because race is not skin color, even though phenotype, or including skin color, plays a part in how we practice racism. And I think that distinction is really important, because if we think of racism as primarily having to do with skin color, then we miss the fact that it's fundamentally about power, right? And it also, I think, unintentionally reinforces a biological notion of the category of race as well, because skin color is biological, right? I mean, that is a biological fact in terms of our genetic makeup. And so, yeah, so I invite us to think about race/ism, and therefore race, as maybe sometimes including something to do with phenotype, but also as something fundamentally different and corrupt and pernicious, that is separate from the beautiful skin tones that we may have. And then the other thing I'll add is one of the rules or tenets of the Wayfinder is that race/ism is not the same everywhere, or as philosophers would say, it doesn't travel. Because you have different types of racisms across time, across place. And it's, of course, important to recognize it for, even if no other reason, the reason that because it's different across time and place, I think could give us hope in some ways, right? Because again, right, change is inevitable, transformation is inevitable, growth, progress, all of the things, evolution, right? These things are inevitable, and including how we practice dividing ourselves.
Thank you to all the speakers. My question is for Dr. Mason. My name is Deborah Goldberg, and I'm at George Mason University. I'm a public health researcher. And so much of our research looks at race and differences in health outcomes and access to care based on race and this data that we have. And for example, one of the things that we know is that there's a huge difference in maternal mortality among Black African American women versus other races in the United States. And so this is really important for us to look at. Yet I struggle with this whole notion of collecting data on race because, as you stated earlier, it's a social construct, and just collecting this data and looking at it adds to racism. And so I struggle with this all the time because I get very angry when I see a survey, even though I'm using the data in my research. And sometimes I put those questions in my research because they're important things for us to look at to address inequities in healthcare and in social services. So it's a huge struggle that I have in knowing that this is also a contributor to racism. And so my question is, how do we move? Like, I would love to imagine a world where we don't ask any of those questions on the US Census or any surveys anymore. But how do we move from where we are to where we don't have to ask those questions and to look at that?
Thank you so much for your question. That's a softball. I've got an answer prepackaged and ready. A couple of things, right? Like, first, I'm not saying that we should skip to the good part. And I think sometimes in hearing me talk, or at least in focusing on my conclusion, right, to end racism, we have to end our belief in race. Some people think, oh, she's saying we got to skip to the good part, and we just, like, race language disappears from everywhere and now we're fine, right? And that, of course, is not what I'm advocating for. And yet, as you said, there is a tension there between recognizing the social impact and social determinants that cause some of those disparities that you're talking about, while not misinterpreting the data that is racialized, right, as evidence of biological race. So one of my friends at SUNY Downstate is a geneticist, and he does work along these lines to where he looks at how there are health disparities or inequities because of the racialization of the patient or the victim, right, by the healthcare providers and the pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's indisputable that that type of data collection can be problematic, but I think it invites us to be better translators of what's actually being shown there or communicated. And then I say all that, and I also think in some ways, if we constantly collect data around the same information, there are always going to be disparities and differences among groups that are racialized differently. And to my mind, it's illogical to conclude that it's evidence automatically of race/ism, if that makes sense. Just the reality of the difference, right, between groups. Because no matter how let's say we did this by eye color or something, like there are going to be different outcomes for people with blue eyes and people with brown eyes or hazel eyes or whatever, right? Like there are always going to be differences among human groupings. But then it's a sensitive aspect of this dialogue, because if you lead with that, then it could be misconstrued as saying like, oh, racism isn't a thing or whatever. But like sometimes I think that is the correct conclusion. And I also think that interpreting race into something external that's happening with African American mothers, for example, is necessary. And then the last thing I'll say is there could be a bridge to talking about the tension and not wanting to get out of the changing same, and getting to the future where racism is no longer a determinant in health outcomes, right? And I have a friend, Carlos Hoyt, who says, and he's advocating for the census, he's trying to start a movement. So I see some of you looking like, yeah, Carlos Hoyt is a familiar name. He wrote Arc of a Bad Idea. For the census, he's advocating for them to change the language, kind of as I've indicated, right? I get racialized as X by people. I racialize myself as X, or I do not racialize myself at all. Which to me isn't like a perfect solution, but it's a solution that somebody has put out there to help bridge us to a future where perhaps that kind of data collection isn't necessary in the first place. And then the last thing I'll say is the U.S. Census, as I understand the history of it, is I almost want to say never. The objective of the U.S. Census is never, more often than not, about actually helping its citizens. That's my understanding or interpretation of the history too. So the notion that they're collecting this race data to help us, I think is wildly incorrect based on history. And if you look at the U.S. Census Bureau's statement on race, they acknowledge like, oh, race isn't anthropological, biological, or anything else. It's just we're going off of how you guys see yourselves, as if they're not the ones putting us in the matrix in the first place, right? So
I know Dr. Christopher wants to jump in too.
Sorry, I know you directed your question to my colleague, but I have to respond. First of all, I have to acknowledge the work of so many pioneers, people of color and others over the decades, to get us to a place where we could have this conversation. Now, at our website, nche.org, we have what we call the Hope Data Initiative. And we too got tired of always reiterating the inequities. And so we designed with generous funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and we brought together many of the scholars in the field of public health, and particularly health equity, and we developed an approach to using the data to drive progress, right? So people, we have all of the health data, social determinants of health data for all of the states and the country. And then we enable community leaders to come together and use a formula that we call distance to goal, right? So in other words, what can we accomplish together to achieve the desired outcome? Now, the data landscape in our country is what it is, and it is an important tool for us as people who care about health equity. It's still an important tool for us to use in creative, constructive ways to help us achieve the goal. Now, it is one thing to be esoteric and to be philosophical. It's another thing to lose babies and mothers needlessly because the quality of care that we deliver is colored by our lenses of racism and economic isms in terms of lack of opportunity and so forth. So I would be remiss if I allowed this conversation to not deal with the reality of the efforts to achieve equity and fairness and the necessity of using data in that effort. This is a 50-year-old movement in terms of health equity, and people have been on the front lines trying to make that happen, and we've gotten better at how we take the data that we do have and we translate it into a way to establish measurable goals and outcomes that will lead us to a different set of realities for our community. So I just, I couldn't be part of this panel and not remind us that, the work is happening and it is not abstract or esoteric, it is real. We are changing the lived experience of people because we come together, we use the information we have, we set achievable goals, and then we strive to hold people accountable to achieve those goals.
Thank you.
But also, if we don't teach children to be in the confines of race/ism in the first place, they wouldn't grow up into doctors and healthcare providers who then are looking through that framing and lens, right? And then ultimately having negative and even violent impacts on patients. I just want to add that because, to me, get to the root.
It's not either or, it's both and. So that's the important takeaway.
Yeah.
This question actually is one that could be actually the topic of a whole panel. As you can tell, and one that our office has been thinking a lot about, the sort of practical and pragmatic use of it. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, and there was a young person here. I thought I'd give him a chance to ask, and then we'll give the panel a chance to answer one final question from our wonderful moderator, and then we'll transition to the book.
So my question is, what do you think we need to accomplish to completely think about racism in a different way?
In the plainest terms, we need to invite young people and all people to see the world in less binary ways, in less black and white, pun intended, ways. I think part of the problem that we find ourselves coming up against persistently is the lenses that we inherit encourage and I think actually require us to see things as always this or that, good or bad, black or white, right or wrong, right? And sometimes there's more complexity, right? There's more nuance. There's more muddiness or muddledness. And so what does it look like to have at every level, right? At early education, higher ed, religious institutions, media, government, etc., creating a context in which we are able to see ourselves and each other more clearly outside of these binaries in ways that center the radical love that we've talked about, right? And that center the both and that Dr. Christopher mentioned a moment ago, right? There are scenarios in which both of us can be right about something, even though we feel that the other is entirely wrong, right? And that's not you can't say that necessarily about every scenario. Sometimes there are, if I'm right about something, then I'm right and you're wrong, right? That can't happen. But sometimes we're both right based on what we know, based on our experiences, based on how we see, right? So I think getting out of that binary is fundamentally what's required to make progress as it pertains to racism and all of the other ways that we divide ourselves from ourselves.
I want to thank all of you for these questions and so forth. And before we give it a final applause, though, because we have all of these really wonderful, like-minded people in the room, I'm thinking a lot about how the Universal House of Justice, which is the leading body of the Baha'is of the world, they made a statement in a message to the Baha'is of the United States that said racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. And so, given that I would suspect that most of us agree with that, how might we leave this space in a productive way to overcome this profound deviation from the standard of true morality?
I'll try to answer that I think it's through relationships. My first relationship with someone of a different, identity or race was as a young girl. I think I was 15, and we shared a dorm together. And at the end of the summer, she attempted suicide. And she left the note on the bed. We had bunk beds. And the note said, "My father, who I knew was a Cleveland police officer, has taught me to hate black people. And I know that's a lie, and I don't want to live like that anymore." I don't know if she survived her attempt, but I do know that it was this relationship that we had developed, two innocent teenagers just seeing the world without the veil, if you will, of this difference, although she was white and I was black. And I think in some ways that experience stayed with me and helped me to design these programs over the years with this notion of bringing people together to truly lift that veil and connect at a deeply human level. And the more opportunities we have to do that, the more our own inner spirituality and consciousness, like that of the Baha'i faith, it tells us that this thing is immoral and it's wrong. And we are moved to stand up against it, just like more than 25 million people stood up a few years ago for justice when George Floyd was killed. There is something in us that recognizes the truth of our equal value as human beings. And we know this idea of a false hierarchy of humanity. We know it's a lie. And the more we interact with people whose lived experience is different than our own, the more we reinforce that innate knowledge and understanding.
I've lost the prompt.
Well, we have all of these wonderful and like-minded people. Maybe there's something that you think maybe they can take with them in terms of this overcoming of this racist ideology that we're all governed by.
I think one invitation that I would like to extend is, one of my many invitations, is to consider how each of us as individuals, we participate in different ways in the machinery of race/ism. And while it's probably easier to look at other people and feel anger or angst, right, or tension or righteousness, right? Those people over there, they've got it wrong, right? As I've described, even recognizing of myself, this is a deeply personal journey as well that arguably has to happen at the same time that we advocate for societal changes and for the larger part of society to come along the same or similar journey. And in focusing on oneself, while that might seem contrary to the communal goals that we share, I find that it is a prerequisite to fostering the kind of radical love that we've been talking about and gesturing toward. Because you have to be in right relationship with yourself, right, as it pertains to your neighbors. And for me, that has been a long journey. I'm still on the journey. So long as I'm breathing, I will be coming along this path alongside everyone else. But that is, I think, a central part that can sometimes be missed because it's super easy to look to the outside and say, that needs to change, that person is wrong, etc. But question your own beliefs, right? I tell my students, question everything, especially if you think you know something. Like if you feel really certain, that's probably the thing that you really need to question, in all honesty, right? And if we can have that kind of openness with ourselves, that fosters a kind of climate and culture where we can have that kind of transparency and openness and vulnerability with each other. And we can share our stories and not be triggered, right? Or feel defensive or be offensive or anything like that, right? Yes, that's what I would like to offer you.
Well, Dr. Mason, Dr. Christopher, thank you so very much for sharing this with us today. Thank you all for your participation.